So, I want to talk about the gender pay gap in the UK. So I'm going to have to do a few things because most people will be familiar with the wage gap, as it's called in the United States. So I need to, because we're talking about something different here in the UK. So I need to make that clear and show you the advantages of the different ways of describing this and the disadvantages of doing that. And the reason that I'm doing all of this right now, partly is because I've got my PC back so I can display some of the information that I'm going to need to show you much more readily. But also is because it was only in the last couple of weeks that this year's statistics were released, and as a result of that, Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, chimed in on this, and this is what Theresa May had to say. This is taken from the government's website, right? This is not some paper's interpretation of what she said. She says, "That's why today I am calling on more businesses, both small and large, to take action to make sure," listen to this bit, "the gender pay gap is eliminated once and for all." So that's what Theresa May had to say. Note the choice of language. It's not reduced. It's not reduced down to just those factors which are warranted. It's that it's got to be eliminated once and for all. And this is somebody, bear in mind who Theresa May is. Of course, she's the Prime Minister, but she's also the leader of the Conservative Party, the right-wing party. And she is actually quite traditionally conservative, quite right-wing, more so than her predecessor. So I would say if this is the kind of thing that Theresa May would say, then there isn't really much likelihood of any future Prime Ministers taking a different tack to this. It's pretty much set in stone that this is the tack that we're going to be taking. Now, is this an issue? I would say that isn't an issue. That's a noble goal if, in fact, every single factor that made up that gender pay gap was something that is as a result of sexism or bias or something that we can legitimately remove. But if some of it is due to factors that it would not be legitimate to remove, that would require perhaps quite coercive means to try and balance out, or coercive restrictions or asymmetric restrictions on men and women to try to tease out of the system, then I think what we'd be doing is we would be placing getting the stats right above looking at actual human beings, actual real people, and the decisions that they choose to make. And also allied to that, the difference that, frankly, having a womb brings, how that plays into the decisions that one may make during one's career, and then how that plays into the different earnings that you are going to have throughout your career. So we'll be having a look at that data and making some comment on that. But before, let me just describe the differences between the way the data is presented in the UK and the USA, because I know that a lot of you will be from the USA, or if not, you will have heard the wage gap argument in terms of the United States, and I think the 77 cents in the dollar. Now, the statistic that is used in the United States is in terms of total earnings. It's called a wage gap, but it's really a total earnings gap. And quite frankly, in terms of a useful statistic to hold this kind of a discussion, it's hardly fit for wiping your arse on, quite frankly, because it doesn't really take account of anything. And one of the key things that that statistic doesn't take account of is the fact that men work longer hours. That just shows up as a kind of pleasant bonus in men's pay packets, of course, but it does mean that you have actually had to work. Statistically, men have worked more hours to get some of the extra money that they've got. And of course, some of those hours won't be plain time hours. This is the other thing. It isn't just that you've worked 10% more hours, so you've got 10% more pay, because some of that will be overtime. And quite rightly, a lot of overtime is paid at a premium rate. We're not talking about a plain time payment. This might be time and a half. This might be double time. Why? Because you've been told at short notice. I know you thought you were going to leave in an hour's time, but we actually need you to hang back another couple of hours. Why shouldn't that be paid at a premium rate? I think most people accept that's quite reasonable. But again, that skews the statistics, and the way that the statistics are shown in the United States doesn't really account for that. Happily, the statistics in the UK, they have their own problem, and I will explain that to you in a minute, but they get round a lot of that. I think it's a better statistic to go with. Rather than going in terms of total earnings in the United Kingdom, what we look at is the median hourly plain time rate of payment. Now, what does that mean? Well, we're looking at hourly rates for a start. So it doesn't matter whether you're working 60 hours, 50 hours, or 40 hours, that's all factored in because we're looking at the hourly rate. It doesn't matter for the fact that some people, one group might be working more overtime at a premium rate, and that's going to skew the statistics because we're not looking at overtime rates. We're not factoring that in. We're just looking at plain time payments. And we're not looking at the mean, we're looking at the median. Why? Because the mean rates tend to be skewed by 1%, 0.5%, 0.1% of the population that are earning these fantastic sums, which gives us a very misleading interpretation of what normal people are earning. So what we're looking at is median hourly plain time rates of payment. I think that's a much better metric. Where we tend to go wrong in the United Kingdom is that the statistic that we look at tends to be for all workers. Statistics are published, separate statistics for full-time workers, for part-time workers, and then for all workers, and we tend to look at the statistic for all workers, and that is grossly misleading. Why? Because part-time jobs tend to pay significantly less than full-time jobs. So a lot of the difference you see is in terms of the proportions of people that are working part-time versus full-time. We'll come to that in a minute. Let me show you the statistics and how the statistics have changed since 1997. So let's click up with the first graph. What I'm showing you on this graph, the top line that you see there is the overall gender pay gap. The yellow line, the middle line, is the pay gap for full-time workers, and the bottom line is the pay gap for part-time workers. Quite interesting, these lines. Just look at the statistics for 2017. What you will see is that the gap for full-time workers is 9.1%. Men are earning 9.1% more than women are working for all full-time workers. It's a little bit strange then. Intuitively, when you see that the gap for all workers is 18.4%, you would probably think immediately, bloody hell, part-time women must be getting paid an atrocious rate of pay relative to part-time men. In fact, that couldn't be further from the truth. The statistic that isn't shown very often, probably because it doesn't fit the narrative, maybe that's just my cynicism, is that for part-time workers in the UK, actually part-time female workers are earning 5.1% more than part-time male workers. So why do we have this statistic here then? If the full-time workers is 9.1% to men and part-time workers is 5.1% for women, how do we get this situation where the overall figure is 18.4% in favour of men? It seems somewhat counterintuitive. It's because we almost have a kind of Simpsons paradox going on here. And the reason that we have that is because by and large, this statistic is made up of two factors. It's made up of one factor, which is that full-time men are earning about 9.1% more than women, but the other factor is that 42% of women are working part-time, whereas only 12% of men are working part-time. And part-time workers earn considerably less as an hourly rate of pay than full-time workers do. So even though part-time women are earning more than part-time men, because part-time workers overall earn so much less than full-time workers, that the overall gap is greater than the 9.1% for full-time workers. Let me show you the next graph because this is really insightful here. So what we're doing here is breaking down just the data for 2017 and breaking it down into these little 5-hour blocks of basic hours worked. These are not overtime hours, remember, these are just basic hours worked, and then looking at the proportion, and I'm going to, let's not get into all of this. I'm going to use males and men, females and women interchangeably because this is the kind of language that they've used. The proportion of jobs worked by males in each hour chunk, and obviously therefore the proportion of females, women that are working those hours as well, and then the gender pay gap for each category. Now, I don't know what is happening in the 0 to 10 block. You may ask the question, it's not particularly relevant to this video, but you may ask the question, why do I think that women are doing better in those part-time hours roles? my suggestion is that largely that is because that when men are working part-time jobs, almost exclusively they're not doing it by choice, and they're doing it in sectors that are either poorly paid or roles within those sectors that are poorly paid. They are unskilled jobs. Whereas a fair proportion of women are women that have had babies and then gone back into the workforce and stayed within their role, or at least within their sector, but have decided of their own volition to reduce their hours, so that rather than working 5 days a week, they are working 4 days a week or 3 days a week. This is something that I will be referring to because this is critical in terms of analysing other aspects of this gender pay gap and aspects that are hard to deal with. But that would account for the fact why women are earning better, because a proportion of the women that are working part-time are doing it in more skilled occupations that remunerate better than their male colleagues working the same kinds of hours. You can see that once you go above that, then it skews back towards men. Again, if I'm going to put my cynical hat on just briefly before we leave this graphic, I can't help but think if all these graphics were entirely the other way round, with men earning more full-time generally, but 79% of those working 45 to 50 basic hours being women, and 50 basic hours and over 73% of those being women, the headlines would be that how grotesque it is that women are working these extraordinarily long hours, and how can we live in a society that expects women to work so many more hours than men. As it is, these are things that are not even mentioned when these statistics come out each year. So that's something that you might want to think on. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the statistics, but I wanted to talk about what we could do then if we were going to try and eliminate this gender pay gap, which is what Theresa May was talking about. And it seems to me that there are 4 possibilities. That kind of excludes the logical possibilities here of the things that you could work on. You can either work on the gender pay gap for full-time workers, you can work on the gender pay gap for part-time workers, you can work on the difference in pay between full-time and part-time workers, and you can work on the proportion of workers for full-time and part-time. Bear in mind, as I said, 42% of women work part-time, only 12% of men work part-time, and part-time work pays less than full-time work. So again, if you altered that, you would potentially you could reduce the gap. Okay, so which are the ones that you can't really work on? Well, the ones that you can't really work on, for one, is the part-time pay gap, because you really don't want to reduce that, right? If you're focused on the statistics, and let's be brutally honest, that's what the government gives a crap about, making the statistics look right. The one thing you really do not want to do is to reduce the gender pay gap for part-time workers, because that's going to make the overall statistic look worse. So that one's off the table. The next one is narrowing the gap between hourly rates of pay for full-time and part-time work. But unfortunately, full-time and part-time work tends to be very different areas of expertise in terms of skill level. So there really doesn't seem to be much prospect of narrowing the gap between full-time and part-time, unless we get some kind of communist takeover and everybody's paid the same thing, regardless of whether you're a barrister or cleaning the toilets, right? Unless that happens, that gap is still going to exist. So really effectively, we're left with 2 choices here. Reducing the full-time pay gap from 9.1% down to a lesser figure, or reducing the proportion of women that are working part-time. Now, let me just say, with regards to the full-time pay gap, I am fairly convinced, and whatever I say to you here, whatever I outline to you here, there is an evidential gap between my claim and what I can evidence for you, right? But having a look at the statistics, and I will show you some of the tables of the statistics, and I will link you to this, that one of the claims is that this full-time gap of 9.1% is not taking into account the fact that men work in different sectors. And that is true, it does not take into account that, and some sectors do pay more than others. But nevertheless, if you look at sector by sector by sector, and if you look at subsector by subsector by subsector, you still see that in the vast majority of these subsectors, in each individual subsector, men are still earning more as an hourly rate than women are. Now, there are differences that can be accounted for here in terms of particular roles, in terms that some sectors do allow you to negotiate your own pay. We can talk about the different ways that men and women negotiate their own pay. But nevertheless, it seems to be so prevalent across so many different sectors, and the statistic does seem to be going down, that I am personally convinced, if you asked me to say, is some of this 9.1% gap still of things that can be tackled, that could be tackled, that should be tackled, that is being tackled, I would say yes. And I expect that 9.1% to go down. Indeed, if you look at the breakdown in age statistics, which again you can look at in this, you will see that up until the age of 40, there is virtually no difference whatsoever. It's about 2%. In terms of full-time pay for all the age bands up until the age of 40. It's only after the age of 40 that the pay gap suddenly spirals up to about 12% between men and women. Now, some of that will be due to differences in career, which I'll be talking about in a minute, but I think also some of it is because a lot of the people that are still in the system started in the system at times when the world was a very different place in the United Kingdom and the job market was a very different place. And so in some ways, they are kind of grandfathered in to that system, and they are showing some of those historical wage gap differences still working through the system. But we've got a problem here. And the problem exists if we want to reduce that 9.1% down to zero, and it also exists if we want to try and reduce the percentage of women that are working part-time. Which we're going to have to do if we're going to take what Theresa May says on board and eliminate the pay gap, and that is the fact that women have babies. And I don't really know how we get around that. So here's the problem and how it impacts on both the full-time pay rate and also the gender gap in terms of full-time and part-time work. If a woman chooses to have a baby, which is her right, and it's something that we want to champion, isn't it? Especially now, we want to make it easy. We want to enable and empower women within the workplace to have babies, right? And to make that possible, to not make women feel like they're so tied into their jobs and the money that they need, that they're not enabled, that they feel that they're compelled to keep working and putting off having babies until it's too late. That's something that we want to get away from. But when a woman gives birth, and let's assume this is a career woman, because that's where it's significant, because if you look at the statistics in the UK, in fact, up until the point where women are starting a family, their pay is comparing even Stevens with men's pay. So this is a particularly significant thing in terms of the statistics. When a woman gives birth, she's had that baby. Let's not soften this. She's had that baby inside her for 9 months, and that's a pretty fucking significant thing. I wouldn't fancy going through that. Then she's had the trauma of childbirth. I've witnessed that. I wouldn't fancy going through that. Then she embarks on her maternity leave. The average maternity leave in the United Kingdom is over 3 months, but many women take considerably longer than that. She's entitled to take up to 52 weeks. She has 90% pay for the first 6 weeks. She has £140 a week, so that's about £600 a month, for the next 33 weeks. So she's been out of the workplace for a period of time, but it's what happens next that's really important. This is the important part of it, right? And the choices that women have, because a significant portion of women choose not to go back into full-time work in their normal sector of employment, in their normal job. And in fact, the more that we empower women and the more that we raise women's levels of earning, the more we're empowering them and the more we're giving them their option. It tends to be poorer women that don't have that option, that go back to work earlier and have to work full-time because they can't afford to do anything else. For the rest of them, the decision that they make, I want to say that couples make, but yeah, the decision that they make is that They do one of three things, really, of those that don't choose to go back to work full time. They either choose to stick to their role in their sector, but reduce their hours down to maybe instead of 5 days a week, 3 days a week, 4 days a week. Or they stay within the same sector and reduce their hours, but choose a less stressful role. This is a point in their life where they've got another very, very significant thing and they want to change the focus, quite understandably. Or they go into a different sector altogether, a sector that they're not skilled in, right? So they can have a less stressful role, so that they can spend more time parenting. And this is what women want to do. And quite frankly, woe betide a father who tries to suggest to a woman when she's got that little baby in her arms, maybe once your maternity leave finished, you can go back to working 5 days a week in your full-time job and I'll reduce my hours down. I'll take an easier, less stressful job and work only 3 days a week because it isn't going to go down very well. I suggest that generally that's a conversation that never even happens. And I don't know, you tell me if you know anybody within the UK that has done that. Everyone I know, and I know a lot of people, a lot of couples, most of them, the woman has reduced her hours for a few years, maybe changed her job role for a few years. I don't know a single case where it's the guy that has done that. And I suggest to you the motive force behind that decision is women. It's mothers that have been empowered to make that decision, and fathers rightfully, I think, go along with that decision because she's the one that's had the baby and she's the one that's formed that bond and blah 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 blah. So I'm very sensitive to that. But think of the ramifications of this. That what it means is that a lot of women that were doing fine, they were equal, even Stevens with the guys in their career, they've just taken 6 months, 8 months, maybe a year away from the workplace. Now they're deciding to reduce their hours down to maybe 3 days a week. Or maybe they've decided to stay within that sector but take on a different, a less stressful role. Effectively, they're putting their career on hold, or they move into a different sector entirely. And that may go on for 2, 3 or 4 years until their children is at school age. If they have a second child, the clock resets and we start all this procedure all over again. Meanwhile, the father has stayed within his job. He may well have even took on more work, or he might have done what I did. It was when my wife fell pregnant that I monetized my Patreon because I knew what was coming up, and that still supports me now with the childcare that we have to pay for because my wife reduced her hours at work, and so I had to make that shortfall up. So bear in mind, just think about what is happening here. Now 3 or 4 years have gone by, and that mother now decides she wants to start focusing on her career again. But you can never make up those 3 or 4 years, can you? If she started on day one with a guy and they're both equal skills and they've got equal interest in the job, equally competitive, everything is equal, and let's say after 7 years, she has a baby, and she has a year's maternity leave, and then she has another 3 years working in the same sector but doing a less stressful job for 4 days a week, and then she wants to focus on her career again. He's now got 11 years experience, 11 years pushing for promotion, 11 years doing all the courses, 11 years driving his career on. She's still stuck at that 7-year mark, effectively. Her experience, some of her skills will have eroded, or if she stayed in the same job but she's only working 3 days a week, she's took some time to get back up to speed again after a maternity leave, and she doesn't have the same time to progress her career because she's only working 3 days a week, or maybe she's been in an entirely different sector altogether and now she's coming back to her sector of expertise and starting the generator on her career from fresh. Even 5 years down the line from this point, or 10 years down the line, or 15 years down the line, she's still going to have that same lag relative to her male colleague, is she not? There's no way of disguising that fact. So how are we supposed to disguise that fact in the statistics? If what you're telling me is we have to eliminate the gender pay gap altogether, how on earth do we reasonably do that when we know that this takes place? It seems to me the only way that you could get close to doing that is to start coercing women into not reducing their hours. into not going part-time, coercing women into staying into these stressful jobs that they don't want to be in, to in some ways coerce couples into a situation where it is more guys that are going to do this and less women that want to do this, even though it's women that want to make this decision. This is the decision that they want to make, and this is kind of what concerns me, because some of these other factors I think that we can deal with. But even if we look across the full-time sector, right, and we had men and women evenly represented in all the different sectors and attracting the same rate of pay in all the different sectors up until the point where women have babies, you still have this problem, which is that after they've gone through this period where they've gone part-time or gone into a different sector, you're still going to have this pay lag effect there. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with the fact that more women are going to be working part-time because they've chosen to work part-time? That is the lifestyle decision they have chosen to make, maybe enforcing on their husband. He's going to have to pick up the slack and go and work even more hours and work even less time with his family. I don't see what the answer is. One of the claims is the answer is more shared parental leave. That's something that we've done in the United Kingdom. It won't work. It hasn't worked in Scandinavian countries because it's a tough, it's a brave man who says to his wife, hey, we've got all this shared leave. How about we share it 50? She's going to tell him to go fuck himself. She's the one that's been pregnant. She's the one that's just given birth. She's the one that's breastfeeding. He can fuck off back to work. Maybe she'd like him, right? It'd be great. Wouldn't it be great? It actually would be great. My wife would have loved to have had me at home for all of that maternity period to help out. That would have been absolutely brilliant. But the practical reality is that that isn't going to happen. And even if fathers were to get week after week of paternity pay, right, it's still at a reduced rate. Couples can't afford to do that. And as a society, we can't afford to pay fathers their full rate of pay while they have month after month after month away from the workplace. This is absolutely pie in the sky to think that that is going to happen. So you're still going to have a situation where mothers are having the vast majority of the leave following the birth of the baby, and you're still going to have mothers driving the decision to go part-time or to change role within sector or to change hours worked within the sector. That's still going to happen, and that's still going to impact on the statistics. If anybody is watching this video and takes issue with what I say, then what you have to be taking issue with is this idea that we can eliminate the gender pay gap whilst this difference in experience that pregnancy and childbirth and everything that follows from it brings without, and do that through legitimate means. I can think of coercive and illegitimate ways of doing it. I can't see legitimate ways of doing it. And yet it's so easy, isn't it, to saying we must eliminate the gender pay gap once and for all. Why aren't politicians engaged in the argument that I'm making here and the intractability of it? Because it's all too messy. It's all too complicated. It all takes too much fucking explanation, doesn't it? When you've got this simple stat, which is that there is gender pay gap of 18.4%, part of it made up from the fact that women effectively have this career break, and part of it made up for the fact that that career break often involves doing part-time work in different sectors that pay less. Okay, interested to hear your thoughts on this one. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.